next subject was obvious. Who was Nate? Anticipating this question, Branson orders an early lunch. The two men move into a less formal area of the conference room. As they occupy a pair of comfortable chairs, Bob Branson begins to tell a story. It's a story about 3 World War II veterans, one white and two black, who served together in an integrated unit in Korea. All were non-commissioned officers. A fast friendship developed between the 3 men, and they agreed to go into business together after the war. By the time that formal ceasefire was signed by North and South Korea, the 3 men, Bob Branson, Nathaniel Gentry, and Marvin Kelly, had decided to go into the steel business and open a foundry that manufactured steel beams and components for the growing commercial construction industry. The racial bias of the 1950s dictated that Bob Branson become the chairman or CEO, even though each of them owned equal shares. With an Anglo male heading the operation, the Cleveland Steel Company, with headquarters in Youngstown, prospered. The mellow Bob Branson and the somewhat volatile Marv Kelly often clashed, with Nate Gentry playing the referee. Unbeknownst to Branson and Gentry, the secretive Kelly, in his will prior to an untimely death, left the voting power of his shares to Nate Gentry. These shares were put into a trust fund. Nate added his shares to the trust fund and made provisions for the fund to be represented by a large law firm with explicit instruction never to reveal his or Gentry's identification. As the company grew, Branson and the trust brought in other investors into a large private stock offering, which diluted their holdings but still left the trust as the largest shareholders. Why did he pose as a janitor? Bob had to remind George that the racial elements that existed in the 1950s would have been opposed to Nate in general, and definitely to Nate as co-chairman, and how in many states, schools, neighborhoods, and public facilities, they were still segregated. He asked George if he could imagine what banks and other investors would have done if they had known a black man controlled Cleveland Steel. So in order to keep up the company's operations, Nate decided to pose as a custodian with all the right keys, his own keys to the kingdom. The company expanded, entered other businesses, and moved to California as Cleveland Diversified, Inc., and built their own 20-story office building in downtown Los Angeles. Nate saw no need to change his operation and viewing habits, so he continued to operate the way he did. George smiles, for now he knows why and what. Why Nate worked the hours he did, and what his last visit meant. Many things are what they appear to be, and many things are not. The vacuum cleaner was used as a prop for a recording device, undoubtedly battery operated for convenience. This is how Nate recorded what he read in the files of the various departments, using, of course, his keys to the kingdom. He and Bob Branson would compare notes and set company strategies. An odd version of Glenn Davis and Doc Blanchard, Mr. Inside, Mr. Outside, touchdowns and all. The vacuum cleaner switch must have been a two-way switch, one position for record and one for the recorded vacuum cleaner sound. A cover for prying ears like George's. After many years, an aging and somewhat careless Nate sometimes forgot to plug the cord in the wall to provide power to his non-working appliance. George smiled again. So every time Nate heard George exit the elevator, he would switch the recording to vacuum sound to disguise his surreptitious operations. But this behavior by Nate, along with others over the years, registered in his peripheral vision and subconscious memory as George hurried by offices being cleaned by Nate. The morning greeting, always initiated by Nate, was to both identify George and also know his location on the floor. Nate the custodian. No, Nate the genius. A slack-jawed and petrified Branson listened to the unbelievable accurate details of George's subconscious visit. Just then, their lunch arrived. While eating in solitude, George's mind begins to drift, so he doesn't immediately respond to Bob's question about asking if he wants to see the locks that went with the keys. As Branson walked across the room to a pair of panel doors, he calls back to George, who was moving a little slower and asks jokingly, did he want to get wheeled across the room, referring to the chair's bronze casters. George hears that and begins to rise. At that moment, Hattie, Bob's executive secretary, knocks, then enters the room, letting Bob know that he has an important call from one of the overseas subsidiaries that couldn't wait. Bob leaves, vowing to return shortly.